Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you as we gather tonight here at Beverly Heights Church. My name is Nate Devlin. I'm the senior pastor here. It is a pleasure to have you for our first inaugural Scattered Seed Symposium. I hope it is an annual event that we'll be able to host here at Beverly Heights Church, a partnership between Beverly Heights Church and Grove City College. I understand we have a number of Grove City College alumni here. If you are, you can raise your hand. All right. Congratulations. We're glad that you're with us. You should be proud because you have among the faculty here at Grove City College a tremendous intellect, author, and teacher in Dr. Carl Truman. We are delighted to have Dr. Carl Truman with us here tonight. Dr. Truman earned his PhD at the University of Aberdeen, and as many of you know, he is a professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College. He is an esteemed church historian, a contributing editor at First Things, and a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Dr. Truman previously served as the William E. Simon Fellow in Religion and Public Life at Princeton University. He also previously served as the Paul Woolley Professor of Historical Theology and Church History at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. Dr. Truman has authored or edited more than a dozen books. He has contributed to numerous articles, and his most recent book is entitled The Rise and the Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. It is a book that is gaining quite a bit of notoriety and popularity. It is tremendously well written, analyzing many of the antecedents that have brought us to the cultural conditions and states that we are in. Dr. Truman is a member of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and has served in pastoral ministry in that church. And finally, Dr. Truman is a host of the popular podcast entitled The Mortification of Spin. Tremendous name. I love it. It's a homage to John Owen and the work that he did entitled The Mortification of Sin, and I would commend you to a hearing of that podcast. Well, again, I'm delighted to be with you tonight as we gather together for the Scattered Seed Symposium. If you would please join with me in welcoming to our pulpit Dr. Carl Truman.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you all this evening. I want to first of all thank Nate and the session at Beverly Heights Presbyterian Church for inviting me to give a lecture, and also to the staff who gave of their time for a magnificent meal beforehand. Usually after eating like that, I like to go away and sleep for a bit. So if I fall asleep in my own lecture, please just leave quietly through the back. I want to talk on the topic of my book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, but I'm not going to give a comprehensive account of what that book contains, nor am I going to go into all of the detail that I go to in that book. I want to pull out a few strands and throw in a few extras, really as a way of trying to help us all understand why the world around us is changing the way it is. One of the striking things of my life over the last 6 months is as I've traveled around and spoken at various conferences on the topic of the book, I think some of the most moving conversations I have been with parents or young people after my lectures, for whom the kind of changes that I look at in my book have become pressing personal issues. It seems that there is barely a family in the West today that has not been touched at some level by the dramatic rise of sexual identity politics. And on the one hand, we can deal with these ideas in the abstract. We can talk about them as ideas that emerge from a historical context. And yet each individual example of the phenomena I'm describing involves true and real human relations, real human pain. I had a conversation just 2 weeks ago after a church service where I preached. I wasn't even dealing with this issue, and a young girl, an 18-year-old girl, came up to me and told me that her brother was transitioning to being her sister. And as a young Christian woman, she had no idea whatsoever how to address this issue or how to relate to this issue. So I hope that what I have to say tonight will be helpful, if in no other way than at least helping us to understand why the rising generations seem to think about things very, very differently to the generations that most of us in this room belong. At the heart of my book, at the heart of my understanding of what's going on in society today, is a concept of what I call expressive individualism. A bit of background to this. I think often in Christian circles, when we look at what's wrong with the world around us, we can tend to default to blaming it all on sin. X has happened because we're all sinful, we're all fallen. And there's a sense in which, as a Christian, I want to affirm that. And yet, of course, human beings have always been sinful since the fall. And so the question of why these particular forms of sinful or wrong thinking emerge at this particular point in time are not answered by that general question. I've got into the habit over the years when I teach history of throwing out early in my history courses the statements. I use it in the book. The Twin Towers fell down on 9/11 because of gravity. Is that a true statement or a false statement? It's interesting. Somebody jumped in it. Yes, it's a true statement. But it doesn't actually tell you anything of any great interest about what happened that day. Apples fall from trees because of gravity, and yet there's a big difference between the falling of the Twin Towers and the falling of an apple. What I'm interested in is why people think in the particular way they do at particular points in time, in particular places. And what I want to get at in this lecture is this notion of sexual or gender identity, but I'm not going to go at it from the perspective of, okay, let's go straight for it and try to work out what it is. My conviction is that our sexual identity politics actually circle around a broader concept, and that's the concept of expressive individualism. Here is how the great American sociologist Robert Bellah defined expressive individualism in his book, Habits of the Heart. Expressive individualism holds that each person has a unique core of feeling and intuition that should unfold or be expressed if individuality is to be realized. Now, that's a fancy way of saying expressive individualism holds that who you really are is how you feel inside. And that therefore the fulfilled life, the life of true flourishing and fulfillment, is the one where those inner feelings can be expressed outwardly. You might say, well, can you give me a concrete example of how that plays out? I use in the book the example of myself and my grandfather. My grandfather's been dead nearly 30 years. Loved my grandfather dearly. If I'd asked my grandfather, did you get job satisfaction, Grandad? Now, my grandfather was a sheet metal worker in a factory in Birmingham in the industrial heartland of England. You may have worked out from my accent, I don't come from Camden, New Jersey. A little bit further east than that. My grandfather was a skilled manual worker in a factory. He left school at 15. He did the same job every day until he retired at 65. If I asked my grandfather, do you get job satisfaction from your job? First of all, I think he'd have been puzzled by the question. It would not have been a concept that kept him awake at night. Secondly, if I'd explained the concept to him, I think he'd have said, well, if you're saying, did my job allow me to meet my responsibilities to others? Did it allow me to put shoes on my children's feet, bread on the family dinner table, meet my obligations to those to whom I owed money? Then yes, it gave me job satisfaction. If you ask me the same question, my answer is likely to run along these kind of tram lines. Yeah, I get a great buzz out of teaching kids in the classroom and seeing the lights go on in the eyes as a previously difficult or opaque concept suddenly makes sense to them. Notice the difference in the two answers. My grandfather's answer, his world was all about him meeting, we might say, his material obligations to others. And that's what made the job worthwhile. For me, what makes the job worthwhile is, you might say, the sense of satisfaction or validation that it immediately brings to me. That's expressive individualism. I emerge from a world of expressive individuals where, we might say, meeting my psychological desires and needs is the supreme purpose of my life, by which everything else is to be judged. The question then is, how do we get here? How do we get from the world of my grandfather to the world of myself? On a broader platform, we might reframe that question by saying, how did we get from a world where we imagined ourselves to be as my grandfather imagined himself to be, to a world where we imagine ourselves to be as we are today, as expressive individualists? Let's take an extreme example of expressive individualism, the trans phenomenon. When somebody says, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, what are they saying? They're saying that who I fundamentally am is who I feel I am inside. And even my body cannot and should not stand in opposition to that. And think about the shift in our society that indicates. If you'd gone to the doctor 100 years ago and said, Doctor, I think I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, the doctor would have said, that's a problem. It's a problem with your mind. And we need to treat your mind to bring it into conformity with your body. If you go to a doctor with that statement today, in some places, the doctor is now legally obliged to say, well, that's a problem, and it's a problem of the body, not of the mind. Just as an aside, the trans phenomenon is an interesting thing. I think it might be the only thing in medical history where patients are now being allowed to diagnose themselves without any pushback from doctors. That shows the level of authority that inner psychological states, or some inner psychological states, have come to have in modern society. Think about how we routinely identify ourselves today. People say, well, I'm lesbian, or I'm gay, I'm straight, or I'm queer. And I deliberately include straight in there because I think we're all complicit in this. It's an odd world where we identify ourselves in terms of our inner sexual desires. In ancient Greece, there was a lot of homosexuality. But I never came across in my classical studies anybody in ancient Greece who identified as gay. Today, you could have a child go to a parent and say, Mom, Dad, I think I'm gay, and that child is not actually making any statement about any activity in which they may ever have engaged. They're making a statement about their inner psychological desires. How do we get to a world where our inner psychological states, we might say, have taken on such authority? Well, what I want to do in the major part of this lecture today is I want to sketch out a brief intellectual genealogy of this. The theorists of this, if you like. Can't do them all, but just sketch out the intellectual storyline. And then I want to offer some thoughts on why this story has become plausible, even to those of us who may never have read the great thinkers and philosophers who formulated the storyline. So first of all then, the intellectual genealogy. And I break this into three. They're rather simplistic categories, but I think they sort of help you get the gist of the narrative. There's an inward turn, there's a sexual turn, and there's a political turn. The inward turn. The inward turn, the turn towards the importance of inward psychological states, really starts, I think, in the West at the Reformation. It's not that prior to the Reformation people had no inner life. You read the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is full of reflection on the inner state of the mind. The psalmist despairs, the psalmist laments, the psalmist rejoices, the psalmist feels things. You read the Confessions of Augustine. Confessions of Augustine are cast as a long internal narrative. It's the study, the story of Augustine's inner states. What's interesting, I think, about that literature, about the Psalms and about Augustine, is that the inward turn is always done for the sake of the outward turn. Psalm 73 was a good example. I was looking around the world and I saw that young, decent people perish early and they die horrible deaths. Wicked, greedy people, they seem to live on forever, and when they die peacefully and quietly. And I was really perturbed in my soul about this until I went to the sanctuary. There's that outward turn. Even Psalm 88, the most introspective and despairing of the Psalms, begins with the covenant name of God. There's always an outward reference by which the inner reality is ultimately to be judged. What we see with the Reformation and then gaining traction in the 18th century is a move inward that does not lead to a move outward. In my book, I focus particularly on the writings of the great Genevan philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau is a fascinating thinker. His fingerprints are all over modern culture, politics, education, etc., etc. A very influential figure. If we were to boil down Rousseau's thinking into a couple of sort of sound bites, we might say one of them is that Rousseau thinks it's society that screws you up. You're born fundamentally okay, but what happens through your social relations is that cry of nature that should be all you need to be a decent moral person gets twisted by the kind of envy and competition you engage in. I sat on the soccer board in the township I was at in Philadelphia for a couple of years. And if ever you want to see how social relations mess people up, you need to be at the board meeting just after the rosters have been announced. For some reason, it was always the 11-year-old parents. It never moved. It was always the 11-year-old parents who, frankly, behaved like 11-year-olds, came and made trouble about the roster. And you got a real taste there of parents living out their ambitions through their kids and how that twisted friendships and did all kinds of stuff. So Rousseau's on to something. Society messes you up. And that will lead, of course, to language of authenticity. The language of the real you being made inauthentic by the society in which you live. I would recommend that you read Bruce/Caitlyn Jenner's interview with Diane Sawyer. You can find a transcript of it online. It was on the 60 Minutes program, but it's transcribed online. Jenner's language is fascinating. Jenner's language is the language of authenticity. All my life I've been living a lie. Finally I'm free to be my real self. That's Rousseau kind of language. All my life society has pressed me into its alien mold. Finally, I'm free to allow the real inner me to express itself outwardly. It's the language of Rousseau, used, I think, in a way that Rousseau would never have anticipated. But it's the language of Rousseau. Second thing one might say about Rousseau is this. He has that famous statement, man is born free and everywhere is in chains. I repeatedly try to press on the students I have that just because a statement is self-evident rubbish does not mean that it will not grip the imagination and cause people to build entire civilizations upon it. Man is not born free. I'm fortunate enough to be, my wife and I were expecting our first grandchild next March. The child is a girl. I don't know anything about her as yet, but I do know this. She will not be born free. If she pops out of the birth canal and is then abandoned in a wood somewhere, she will be dead within 72 hours. She's not born free, she is born utterly dependent. And one of the weirdest things about human beings is how long we are utterly dependent upon others for our survival. Human beings should not be defined by their autonomy and freedom. They should actually be defined by their relationships of dependency and responsibility. But even so, it's Rousseau's idea that has come to grip the imagination. Human beings are born free. And that makes every other social relation, first and foremost, potentially something that renders you inauthentic. Fascinating amicus brief filed in the Dobbs case by 500, I think, women athletes. The language is fascinating for a number of reasons. And one of them, of course, is that traditional language about abortion where the baby in the womb is an alien presence preventing the woman from reaching her full potential. It's fascinating, fascinating language. So we have the inward turn, and the inward turn is popularized by the great romantics. If you read Mary Wollstonecraft, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, their prose and their poetry represents a distinct development in Western culture that pitches straight for the emotions. You could perhaps get this most obviously listening to music. Compare Beethoven's early symphonies to his later symphonies. Listen to his late string quartets, then compare them to Bach. Even compare them to Mozart. And you realize that form is starting to break down in the service of something else. I hesitate to talk about music because I see my banjo tutor, my bluegrass banjo tutor, is in the audience tonight. I hesitate to mention bluegrass banjo in the context of Beethoven, etc., etc. It's about all I'm capable of pulling off musically, I'm afraid, and it's hard work just to get that far. But romantic music witnesses to the fact that it's no longer conformity to outward form that's important. It's what you feel in here. It impresses on you that the most important thing about you is what you feel. It's what you feel. It's not incidental, I don't think, that Rousseau, as I understand it, tried to develop his own theory of music notation. He wanted a more authentic form of musical notation than that which had tried before. He should have known from the failure in that project that maybe the whole Rousseau project was wrong-headed. The self, in short, with this inward turn becomes psychologized. Don't have time to go into this in detail, but what saves the romantics from kind of pure subjectivism is that they still believe that there is such a thing as human nature. And by human nature, I'm not talking about the basic biological construction, the fact that human beings can only reproduce with other human beings. I mean human nature as having an end. Human nature as having a moral structure. That is pretty much abolished in the 19th century. Read Nietzsche. Nietzsche's view of human nature is it's a construct designed to prevent the individual from truly realizing their potential. So the inward turn in the 19th century gets unhitched from anything that transcends, anything that would give a transcendent basis, if you like, for understanding what it means to be a human being. We might add any kind of transcendent external authority beyond that of the feelings of the individuals. So that's the first thing then. First part of the genealogy is the inward turn. Secondly is the sexual turn. Okay, so we've unhitched this inner space and we've made it the fundamental aspect of what it means to be a human being. How does it get sexualized? Well, the key figure in that is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is the man who, he sort of agrees with Rousseau. Yeah, the real you is that inner space. But where Rousseau saw that inner space as a kind of idyllic, pastoral place, Freud saw it as a dark and destructive and profoundly sexual place. And what Freud does, which is interesting, is he extends sexual desire back to infancy. And in his 3 essays on sexuality, what he does is very clever. He produces a taxonomy of growing up, articulated entirely in terms of sexual desire. Now think about what that does. We talked about ancient Greece. I said, ancient Greece, homosexuality is rife. I remember as classics translating a love poem, and then suddenly the penny dropped that this woman writing this love poem was writing it to another woman. It was a sort of, just shows you in the mid-1980s how naive students were in the mid-1980s that kind of made me sit up and take notice. Today that would be routine. But nobody in ancient Greece identified themselves in terms of their sexual desire. What Freud does is he says that which is most constitutive of you at any given point in your life from infancy onwards is your sexual desire. That, of course, provides the basis for where we are today. That we define ourselves in terms of what we say our sexual orientation. You're attracted to people of the same sex, different sex, both? Are you lesbian, gay, straight, bi, etc.? That taxonomy that is so natural to us now would have been very weird 300 years ago. Because the idea that you were your sexual desires would have been a novel and intriguing concept. It's been naturalized after Freud, and that, of course, sets up the play for the third move, the political turn. Once sex is identity, think about it. Once sex is identity, moral sexual codes become political. Because telling people what sexual desires are legitimate and what are illegitimate, what sexual behaviors are legitimate and what are illegitimate, that's not simply talking about behavior. It's talking about identity at that point. Talking about identity. This is why I think that Christians who think that they can talk to those who identify as gay and use the old strategy that we did when I was a student, and that's say, we hate the sin and love the sinner, that doesn't work anymore. Because the behavior identifying as sin is actually an identity. So you can't separate the person from that, or at least the person you're talking to can't make that conceptual separation. Which means your pastoral and apologetic strategy has to be radically different today, I think, to what it was even 20, 30 years ago. And that paves the way for the sexual revolution. One of the things I would say about the sexual revolution is most conservative Christians don't understand what it is. We tend to think of the sexual revolution as, for want of a better term, an expansion of the canon of legitimate sexual behavior. Where once upon a time, sex before marriage was considered sinful, now it's okay. Where once upon a time, homosexuality was considered sinful, now society thinks it's okay. We tend to think of it, if you like, as you have this set of acceptable sexual behaviors and expressions that's just being broadened. No. Once sex becomes identity, the game changes completely. Think of it. Discussions of sexual morality today, they do not address the issue of the intrinsic morality of sexual acts. They are rooted almost entirely in the context of the sexual acts. What makes a sexual act legitimate is not the nature of the sexual act itself, it's the question of whether everybody involved consents to it. And that's a sea change in how sex is understood. The Bible presents sex as having an intrinsic moral value. Now it only has a contextual moral value. One could also look at the Fate of Modesty. Now, I remember churches in the 80s would occasionally get into big debates about modesty. Looking back, they were generally horribly sexist debates, by and large, because they tended to focus on women's clothing. And the debates were, how short can a skirt be and still be modest? Can a woman wear a one-piece bathing suit or a two-piece bathing suit? Those are the kind of questions. What was interesting about those debates was there was no discussion about the legitimacy of the concept of modesty. Everybody assumed there was such a thing. The debates were about where the limits should be set. Modesty is now an inherently ridiculous concept. Nobody debates modesty anymore. My wife and I remember some years ago when one of our sons graduated and we went to the graduation at the high school, and we were shocked at the way some of the girls dressed. And it's actually a militant atheist friend of ours was shocked and went to complain to the headmaster and said, these dresses, if a girl's having to pull her skirt down to avoid revealing her underwear as she walks up steps onto a stage, the skirt's too short. These are the words of our atheist friend, not the words of our buddies in the OPC or even the PCA. I mean, if we move it out to sort of more liberal domain. Couldn't resist that crack. Couldn't resist a quick shot there. I hope my friend Todd Pruitt's listening, because that one was for him. But the headmaster's response was something like this: I agree, but there's nothing I can do about it, because if I try to bring in a dress code, the parents tell me I'm oppressing their children. Well, that's a world where the concept of modesty is gone. I use the example in the book. I say I've never, ever seen the movie The 40-Year-Old Virgin, but I know it's a comedy. I know it's a comedy because we live in a world now where the concept of reaching your 40th birthday without having a sexual experience tells me you're a loser, tells me you're unfulfilled, tells me you're not a truly fulfilled human being. That's the sexual revolution. It hasn't broadened the range of acceptable sexual behaviors. It's transformed the way we think about sexual behavior relative to human selfhood, relative to who we actually are. Okay, at this point you say, well, Truman, this is all very interesting, but very few people have read Rousseau. Maybe a few people have listened to Liszt, but they probably haven't connected any dots to transgenderism or something like that. Why is it now? Why is it that people that I might meet in the high street, my neighbors, whatever, if I say to them, so-and-so thinks he's a woman trapped in a man's body, why does that statement make sense to these people when they've never read Judith Butler or sat in a postgraduate seminar on sexual identity at an Ivy League university? Well, that's where the story gets interesting, because the story then becomes one of how the popular imagination has been changed on these things. In the book, I use a concept articulated well by Charles Taylor called the social imaginary. And Taylor's concept of the social imaginary is this: the way all of us think about the world most of the time has nothing to do with arguments we've heard and been persuaded by, and everything to do with how our intuitions have been shaped by the culture in which we live. I know nothing about physics, but I'm pretty sure that when I leave tonight, I'm going to leave through the doorway. I can't articulate to you why doors work and walls don't for exiting rooms. I just intuit the world in a certain way. And that's the same actually with moral thinking and thinking about identity. Most of us have not read books on how should I think about my identity. We've just been given, by a kind of osmosis, if you like, a way of imagining ourselves and our relation to the world around us. Well, what are the factors that have shaped these intuitions? I can't give an exhaustive account here, but I want to develop a line of thinking that I didn't really have time to deal with in the book because, well, the book's 400 pages. I don't want to make it any longer or boring. I had one person email me and say, why didn't you start the book with Eve in the garden? And I responded, because I didn't want the book to be 100,000 pages long. I wanted to complete it sometime during my lifetime. So I had to leave a lot of stuff out. Often the key to writing a book is not what you put in, it's what you leave out. And really, the role of technology is a gaping gap in my book. But it's absolutely critical to how we understand the world today. Technology, again, like the sexual revolution, often we can misunderstand the nature of technology. We tend to think that technology allows us to do the same stuff faster and more efficiently. Whereas 100 years ago, it would have taken me a couple of weeks on a long, treacherous sea journey to get back and see my mum. These days, outside of a time of COVID, I can jump on a plane, I can be in my mum's sitting room 12 hours after buying a ticket. But think about that. That's not just doing the same thing faster. That's changing how I relate to the world. Distance has collapsed. The way I imagine the world now is much smaller. When I said goodbye to my parents when I emigrated, I knew I'd see them in a few months' time. I knew that I'd speak to them on the phone within days. That is not the same experience as an emigrant from 300 years ago, who may well have said goodbye to the parents thinking that he or she would never ever see them again. It's not the same thing, only better. It's a different thing. Technology, even if we don't understand it, shapes the way we imagine the world. One of the things it does is it encourages us to think of the world as just stuff that we can manipulate. Technology encourages us to think that we're in control. One of the reasons why COVID, which historically speaking is actually a comparatively harmless and minor plague, Black Plague of the 14th century took out a third of the European population. One of the reasons why COVID caused such panic was suddenly nature bit back and we couldn't control it. And our imaginations can't cope with that. Because technology encourages us to think we're in control. Even now, I think it encourages us to think we're in control of our own bodies. Transgenderism would have been utterly implausible 100 years ago. Now it becomes plausible because technology has delivered surgeries and hormones that allow us to imagine the world where one sex can be changed into another. Also, Marx and Engels point to this in the Communist Manifesto. As industry becomes mechanized, technologized, the difference between men and women in the workplace, which is critical to understanding in some ways the traditional difference between the sexes, begins to shrink because raw physical strength no longer matters in the way that it used to. In the Middle Ages, you've got to be pretty strong, with the exception of Joan of Arc. You've got to be pretty strong to wield a sword in battle. That tilted armies in favor of men. I've no doubt that a woman is just as capable, if not more capable, of flying a drone to drop a bomb as any man is. Think about how that shapes how we imagine the relationship between the sexes. Control, time and space, even bodies cease to have the awesome authority that once they did have. The tendency of technology is towards us thinking of the world as just stuff, which we can subject to our wills. Think also of how people typically thought of identity in the past. Identity was typically grounded in externals. I was talking in class today about Russian novels. Why are Russian novels so hard to get into? Well, the first 50, 60 pages, every character has 2 or 3 different names, and you're trying to work out who's the same character and who's different because they have a patronymic. The middle name, Davidovich, tells you this man is the son of David. That's important. Think of the Bible. The amazing thing about Elijah is we're never told who his dad is. Ahab, son of Omri. Jehu, son of Nimshi. Elisha, son of Shaphat. Elijah the Tishbite. He's exceptional. And the writer there is trying to make the point, his authority doesn't come from his family, as is typical. Family has, by and large, been the place where people gain a large part of their identity. Family is in crisis. The nation. Think of the nation state. Nations provided people with their identities. I was trying to explain to the students today that Americans have traditionally thought about identity very differently to the English. The English sense of identity is more a kind of blood and soil identity. And I said, the amazing thing is, I could become an American citizen and you would all think of me as an American. If you got British passports, I would only ever think of you as Americans who had British passports. You'd never truly belong because the blood and the soil doesn't apply. Nations have been powerful sources of identity. Nations are in meltdown. Families are in meltdown. Nations are in meltdown. I'm fascinated by the existence of the 1619 Project. Not because I'm not making any statement for or against the 1619 Project at this point. What interests me is the fact it exists. when fundamental challenges to national narratives emerge, fundamental challenges to national identities are emerging. The nation no longer provides that identity, that external identity. Technology has transformed the nature of authority. I kind of laugh in a rather sad way these days when I chat to parents who think that because they send their kids to Christian schools or homeschool their kids, that their kids are somehow going to be protected from what's going on. At the moment, the evidence is anecdotal, but it looks to me highly persuasive that the most influential people in young people's lives are other young people on TikTok and YouTube. Read Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage. Again, at this point, it's anecdotal. But one of the things she points to there is that the explosion of numbers of young women wanting to transition to be men is closely related to the culture of TikTok and YouTube on that precise issue. Technology has shattered standard patterns of authority. The world in all of these things is moving from having that structure to having no structure at all. From being something that formed us to being something that is in itself formless. And when we might add to this as well the phenomenon, if you thought the news was bad so far, it's just about to get even worse. I say that with a smile because I'm English, and we take the view everything's going to get worse until it gets even worse than that. That's our basic approach to things. It's in King Lear, isn't it? The line is, as long as you can say it is the worst, it is not the worst. Social acceleration. What is social acceleration? Think about the Reformation. One way of looking at the Reformation is it's 150 years of Europe coming to terms with the printing press. A new form of technology altered structures of power and the way people related to each other. And it took 150 years of bloody religious warfare to bring some kind of stability back. One technological development. Part of the problem we have today is that technological developments, akin to the printing press or even more dramatic, are happening at such a speed that society is not able to assimilate them and stabilize relative to them before the next one comes along. And that's created what the German theorist Hartmut Rosa calls the phenomenon of social acceleration, that everything is getting further away from us all the time. We're not just running to stand still now, we're running in order not to fall back quite as fast as we might otherwise do. Everything is slipping away from us. All of this is to say we live in a world of chaos on one level. The old institutions are no longer strong enough to provide identity and a sense of belonging. And technology is exacerbating that at the same time as our minds are tending more and more to think of the world as stuff. We might also add to that a change in how institutions operate. Institutions in the past were places where one went to be formed. I've used this a couple of times in talks, but day of my graduation from college, all the men had to line up against the wall and raise their trousers, or as you would say, pants, because pants means underwear to an Englishman. It's always slightly comical for me to use that word in my own mind. We had to raise our trousers by an inch, while the head porter, a stern man dressed in a funeral director's outfit with a bowler hat, walked along the line and looked at all of our socks. Because if our socks were not all the same color, if they were not all jet black, you did not graduate. And the point being made was this: you are about to join this institution. You are about to become a proper member, graduate member of the university, which is bigger and more important than you are. And graduation is about you being absorbed into that bigger, more important institution. I'm amazed at graduation, not horrified, but I'm amused at American graduations where the students all do their own thing. They all decorate the hats or they all wear different kind of shoes. I'm thinking, man, you wouldn't even agree. Yeah, I don't care how much money you paid on your degree. Mr. Monument, that was his name, the head porter. What a great name for the head security man, Mr. Monument. The man with the bowler hat would have escorted you off campus, and you weren't graduating that day, mate. That was what the institution of the university was like when I was there. Now, institutions no longer thought of as places of formation, they're places of performance. Which brings us back to where we began, expressive individualism. What lies at the heart of expressive individualism? You belong by performing. And technology, of course, has made all the world a stage, and everybody a potential performer. Again, shaping how we imagine that world. So how does this parlay into the sexual revolution then? Well, I would say this, and with this I'll sort of wrap up. The sexual revolution has transformed how we think about identity. It's given expressive individualism a distinctive sexual form. And a brilliant form in many ways, because without wanting to go the whole Freud, one would have to say that our sexual desires for most of us are perhaps the most powerful things we experience in life. The erotic is a powerful force. It's an easy sell to us that our erotic desires are who we truly are. And when you untether the self from these external institutions of formation, or when they become so weak, they're no longer capable of forming anything. Nation, family, we can throw church into that as well. People still want to be somebody. They still want to belong. And into that vacuum will come the new, strong, powerful, tech-friendly identities, of which I think the LGBTQ movement is one of the prime examples. I'm convinced that not maybe the L, the G, and the B are a little different, but I'm convinced that at the heart of the transgender thing is a real desire to belong. When you read the testimonies, many of them heartbreaking, of transgender people, at the core, there seems to be a desperation to belong, when all of the old means of belonging have become too weak or too implausible to do it. I chatted less than a year ago with a young man. He said he wanted to chat to me, and we met to chat, and we talked. And at some point, he said, I got to tell you, my problem's the T. He said, for the longest time, I thought I was a woman trapped in a man's body. And I said to him, well, okay. One of the great things about having been a pastor for a while is nobody can say anything that shocks me anymore. And I've trained myself to look at people, not the desires they have or whatever. So we're having a nice conversation, and I just say to him, okay, well, that's interesting. Tell me where it began and how it started. And he said, well, it started when I was at school, and I can't remember his exact wording, but essentially said, I was a geeky sort of guy, and all the boys picked on me. All the boys picked on me, and the girls were kind to me. And then he made, what in some ways a naive but profound statement. He said, and I just wanted to be one of them. I wanted to belong. It was a heartbreaking testimony to listen to. But it left me thinking, yeah, the world in which we live, we've created this view of the self that places, if you like, huge responsibility on the individual. You are who you are inside. You have the responsibility for deciding who you are. And at the same time, we have stripped away every external thing that would help the individual make that decision in a sensible and stable way. When I read these stories of these parents who say, my 3-year-old has come out as trans, well, I don't use these exact words, but I won't repeat them. In my head, a phrase equivalent to, you are a moron, flies through my head. And the second statement is, and you're a child abuser. How abusive is it to tell a 3-year-old child that you don't know who they are? They have to make that decision for themselves. That is a disgusting thing. Increasingly, of course, that's becoming the law of various lands. And it testifies, I think, to the collapse of what I would regard as a biblical understanding of identity, rooted in something objective, the image of God, and the collapse of the institutions that help us understand exactly what that means. Thanks for listening so patiently. I've said I will throw it open for questions if anybody has any questions.
If you'd like to ask Dr. Trueman a question, we'll ask you to make your way up to this microphone. Please be sure to make your question as concise as possible, and we'll leave questions open for about 10, 15 minutes.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So if you would like to ask a question, please make your way forward.
Thank you, Professor, for that great lecture. Can you give us some counsel as to how we can engage the culture in which we are living in the midst of all this? How do we begin the conversation of getting deeper into the real need of folks?
Yeah. Well, I think there are so many things that one could say on that front. I think, first of all, one of the things I'm always anxious to stress is I think there's a big distinction. I would make a distinction between the political movement that often surrounds these kinds of identities and the individuals who claim them. That's an important distinction to make. And I would want to be, I would say, ruthless in my opposition to the political movements and gentle and pastoral with regard to the individuals for whom this is their issue. So I'd want to make that distinction. Secondly, I am not a big fan of the language of culture war. I was saying earlier when I was being interviewed on the podcast here, I certainly think martial language is legitimate. The Bible describes the world as being involved in spiritual warfare. But I think that has unfortunate connotations for us today. I prefer to think about the church being involved in cultural protest. How do we protest bad marriages, for example? By exemplifying good marriages. By being, if you like, an alternative culture. Very influenced by my friend Rod Dreher's writings, particularly his Benedict option, when he talks about the church as being, that has to walk to the beat of a different drum. So I think a second way of addressing these issues is to demonstrate to the world around that we have something better. I have every sympathy in the world with a gay couple who take exception to a church objecting to gay marriage, a church that has tolerated no-fault divorce. Too long to go into it just now, but I think the logic of gay marriage rests upon the logic of no-fault divorce. And if you concede the one, then you really ought to concede the other. So I certainly think that is part of it. Thirdly, I think an attitude of humility in the church is important. When I talk about expressive individualism, I'm not talking about them out there. It's why I use myself as an example. I think the church is complicit in this culture. And therefore, our first attitude should be one of repentance. It shouldn't be, I thank you, Lord, that we're not like other men. It should be, is it I, Lord? And then I think community. I think a shift in our imagination. How do we have an impact on the people whose lifestyles and choices we vigorously disagree with? We can tell them they're wrong, and that may certainly be part of an appropriate strategy at points, most certainly. I think telling them they're wrong on Twitter is probably counterproductive. That tends not to go well. But I think if you can talk to people and have a real relationship with them, such that they may disagree with your theology and your views, but they know you don't hate them, then I think that's the way to go. Some years ago, the Nashville Statement was produced, and I was asked to sign it. It's a statement, those of you who haven't heard of it, on same-sex attraction, etc., etc. And there wasn't much in the Nashville Statement that I disagreed with. But I didn't sign it, and I didn't sign it because I thought, as soon as I sign something like that, I'm putting a label on myself that may actually cut off important conversations that I might need to have. Anybody wants to know my views of sexuality or marriage, I can point them to the Westminster Standards, where there's a positive view of marriage set forth. But I wanted to make sure that I was not cluttered by stuff that would stop important conversations that I may have to have. I didn't want to label myself in the eyes of other people an unthinking bigot unless I had to. So I think thinking carefully and strategically, and always remembering that the individuals that one addresses who are struggling with this, they're human beings and sinners like you and I are, and they need to be treated with the same love and respect, and challenged as we need to be challenged on the points where we fall down and fail as well.
I look forward to reading the book. Question I had is, to what degree is what you've just described anthropologically a Western phenomenon? You know, thinking that weird acronym.
Yeah.
To what degree is it exclusive to a relatively narrow, not narrow, but smaller part of the world's population?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, yes, it is a very Western narrative, and I wrote it primarily for a Western audience. Yeah. If you visit somewhere like South Korea, it is very clear to me that the way the culture operates is quite different to that in the United States. At this point in time, of course, we don't know is there going to be a world culture and who's going to win. I'm inclined to think it could well be Western culture because of the role of pop media and YouTube, TikTok, etc., within it. So it could become a more generalized and universal story in generations to come. But I don't think that this would necessarily work in Korea. And certainly in a place like Korea, even if you have young people growing up with a very Western view, the way they're going to relate to their parents is going to be different. So, good question. And I think modernity, as I'm dealing with it in this book, is Western modernity. We now know that India, China, Russia all offer different forms of modernity where this narrative might actually work out very, very differently.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for the lecture. I'm curious about, as I read Paul specifically in Galatians and Romans, I see men or people who practice such things rather than, we talk about there's the soft man in Romans, but really it seems like these are the actions that you perform.
Yeah.
So if you're counseling a friend or maybe a congregant or something, to what extent are we trying to get someone to think in a way that because Paul, I don't think, thought this way,
yeah,
which seems like what you're saying. To what extent are we forcing people to think biblically, and to what extent can we think biblically? We're swimming in this water now. It'd be tough to wholly bring ourselves back 2,000 years.
Yeah. Good question. And I think I'll preface my answer by saying one of the temptations that we need to avoid, of course, is forgetting the supernatural in this. I'm a believer that conversion is a supernatural thing. Now, there's no way we can quantify or analyze that, but that should be a source for hope for Christians, in that it's not down to the strength of our arguments to pull this off under our own strength. I do think are you asking the question about, is it okay ultimately to say to a celibate Christian friend, it's okay to identify as gay, as long as you don't engage in the behavior? Is that sort of the background to the question, somewhat?
Well, I wouldn't say that, but that certainly, I know those debates are raging.
Yeah.
Because I would agree, I think probably with you that wouldn't be an appropriate designation for a Christian to have. But because I don't see Paul addressing that head on, because it seems to me that he's thinking of punctiliar actions.
Yeah.
I'd wonder how we would.
Yeah, the whole sort of Freudian idea of sexual desire as identity is simply not part of Paul's universe. And I think that makes it difficult in some ways to move straight from the text of Scripture to pastoral situations today. And that's why in the lecture I was careful to include straight in the taxonomy, because I think that we can actually concede the ground without realizing we conceded the ground. As soon as we start talking about straight Christians, you've conceded the ground whereby Christians can identify in terms of their sexual orientation. And I think that's problematic. So I think all Christians, we have to somehow unlearn the world's way of thinking on that point. How we go about doing that, how we persuade people to do that, it's not immediately obvious to me. It's very difficult. It is the water we swim in. I was asked this afternoon on the podcast, so if we're all expressive individualists, how do we go about getting rid of expressive individualism in the church? Well, it's problematic on two fronts. One, expressive individualism does actually capture some truths. What you feel is important. And secondly, we live in a world where we have religious freedom, which is great, but it does mean you can choose where you go to church. You can make church a personal choice, which it wasn't in the Middle Ages. The power of the church to be a place of formation is dramatically weakened by that. Having said that, I do think that knowing this is a problem, whatever the solution is, and I'm not sure exactly what it is at this point, but whatever this solution is, identifying the problem has to be the first step towards it. Knowing that this is a problem and getting people to think about it as a problem is the first step towards finding a solution. So I suppose my answer to you is, I don't have a solution, but I think identifying the problem will take us one step closer to what it is. And I also think, in light, in some ways, of the question about Westernism and that, it could well be that the solution looks different in different circumstances. One of the problems I had when I was a seminary professor was students would always ask me, well, what do you do in this pastoral situation? And the answer is always, well, I don't know, because every pastoral situation is unique. There are certain general principles one applies, but one makes judgment calls about how to apply them because the context, the culture, the background, the history is always unique. And I think that might apply in this problem. Chatting to somebody who identifies as gay one day might be very different to chatting to somebody who identifies as gay the next. My first strategy would always be to, okay, let them talk. Let me get a handle on this and see what the issues are. So, bottom line is, I have no how-to answer, but I hope that understanding the problem will enable us to move towards an answer on that.
Thank you again for the lecture. Your very first comment really struck me about your grandfather. It seems to me, as I listen to you, this is all about self. Your grandfather subjected himself for the benefit of his whole family, even for his company, to succeed, even for England. He lived through world wars. Yeah. He knew what living for others meant, sacrificing for others. This whole description you've made of the rest of the lecture seems all about me and why I can express myself, even maybe to cause trouble for others. It doesn't matter if that's who I am, that's what I have to do. I'll step on who I have to. Isn't it the me generation? I don't remember when that happened, but isn't all that a huge part of it? Self-interest as opposed to the biblical standard of others?
I think it goes down to that contrast I drew with Rousseau and what I consider to be reality. It's the triumph of Rousseau's view of humanity as fundamentally autonomous. It's the autonomous individual that makes every other social relation, first and foremost, potentially oppressive. Man is born free and everywhere is in chains. It is not coincidence that Rousseau has all 5 of his children taken to an orphanage shortly after they are born, because they're links in the chain. He has no responsibility towards them, and they simply exist to hinder his reality, to hinder his fulfillment. And I think what we've seen in the last 20, 30 years is the final triumph of Rousseau's view of autonomy. Whereas for my grandfather saw human beings as those who stand in relations of dependency and responsibility towards others. Carter Sneed's excellent book, What It Means to Be Human, came out around about the same time as mine last year. It's always good to read a book that sort of takes a different angle but confirms the basic thesis. And Carter's argument there is, we've taken a fundamentally wrong step in seeing human beings as autonomous. We clearly are never autonomous. We start off utterly dependent. We grow to a position where others are dependent upon us, and then if we live long enough, we decline back to a position where we are dependent upon others again. I think I'm at the tipping point at this point. My kids are no longer dependent upon me, and I'm looking forward to being dependent upon them and getting some payback at some point in the near future. And I think if you imagine human beings as responsible and dependent, you will naturally relate to the world differently than if you imagine yourselves as autonomous. Are we characterized by rights or by responsibilities? Well, I might put it that way. Well, as an Englishman, I can criticize the Declaration of Independence because I think it was an illegal colonial rebellion. So I'm going to criticize it right now. Had I been Jefferson, Jefferson was a brilliant prose writer, but the pursuit of happiness That is a disastrous clause in the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, life and liberty, fully on board with that. I wish he'd said ownership of property. That would have been a good, nice, objective one. Pursuit of happiness. When Rousseau's way of thinking about human beings grips the imagination, pursuit of happiness comes to mean something very different to what I think the founders thought it meant. It becomes rather irresponsible at that point. So, joking aside, Declaration of Independence, amazing document, but that clause has become problematic because of that shift in the notion of self that you've identified between my grandfather and myself.
Dr. Truman, I have seen statistics where when individuals undergo sex changes at a young age, they rarely live past their early 20s, mid-20s.
Yeah.
Which would lead me to believe it's a psychological problem, and should the medical community not look at that or before they just start whacking body parts on or off?
Yeah, the transgender issue is a disturbing one for a number of reasons. First of all, transgenderism tends to be used as an umbrella term for a number of phenomena. There are intersex people who are born with the sexual characteristics of both sexes. My understanding of that is typically the person is strongly tilting one way or the other, and that can be rectified in a relatively straightforward manner. There is also some interesting work done on brain patterns that indicates that some men, some women can have brain patterns that correlate, interestingly, with the brain patterns of the opposite sex. I think that the teenage... I was chatting to somebody the other week at a school where 40% of the girls in his high school now identify as trans. That tells me that's not a medical problem. I don't even think that's a psychological problem. I think that's a cool problem. It's becoming the cool thing to be. So there are a whole host of factors, I think. I think the number of people who are genuinely struggling with long-term gender dysphoria is very, very small indeed. The terrible thing is, and I saw some silly professor on a YouTube video recently saying, we should be allowing young teenage girls and boys to make decisions about the gender. We allow young teenage boys and girls to make decisions about important life things all the time. To which my answer is, yes. We allow kids to decide which college they go to. And some of those kids will make the wrong decision. And guess what? 15 years down the line, for most of them, it will make no difference. You have a teenage girl have her breasts removed, or a teenage boy have his testicles removed, or be subject to hormone treatment. You are engaging in medical procedures that will prevent those kids from doing things like conceiving, that they have no conception of whether they want to do that at 14 or not. It is the job of adults to protect children from themselves. Yeah, let me go. If you're a 25-year-old and you think you're a woman trapped in a man's body, and you want to go through gender reassignment surgery, I'm enough of a sort of libertarian to say, fine, do it. You're an adult. Adults do stupid things, and we live with the consequences, but we do them from a position of adulthood. Not a 13-year-old girl, not a 13-year-old boy. That's ridiculous. So, and what you pointed to in the statistics, the suicide statistics are interesting. Suicide rates are catastrophically high for transgender people, even among those who have medically transitioned. To which the riposte is typically, in the United States, well, that's because society is not affirming and supportive. And that seems a reasonable, that's a reasonable hypothesis. But then when you compare the statistics with, say, Sweden, which is a nation with a long and hallowed history of being very supportive of such people, and you see that there is only a negligible difference in the suicide statistics, any sane person would say, okay, altering the body and the hormones is not solving the problem here. We need to find another strategy. Unfortunately, Western culture is so in the grip of powerful political lobby groups that is the diagnosis that dare not speak its name. Now, make no mistake, I've given a lecture tonight that if I taught, there are very few colleges I could teach at in the United States where I could give this lecture and turn up for work tomorrow morning without finding an 8:30 appointment with the provost and the head of human resources already on my calendar. It's that powerful. It grips the imagination of the culture that strongly.
They save the worst for last. No, thank you, Dr. Truman, for the lecture. You had mentioned Charles Taylor throughout the talk, and one of the things that he talks about at the end of his book that I recently read is when you turn towards the interiority, the the expressive individualism, you move from a kind of external understanding of good and evil that you have to be conformed to. And one thing that happens, he says, is that you can see the world as there are evil people and then there are victims. And I'm wondering if that, on college campuses, I certainly see the victimhood identity play out a lot, and I wonder if you can speak a little bit. Do you see that as part of this whole picture at all?
I mean, when you think about it, when you start to internalize the real self, when you are your feelings, then, Thomas Jefferson has that wonderful statement, what does it matter if my neighbor believes in one God, 20 gods, or no gods at all? It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. That, I think it's in his notes on the state of Virginia, that statement. That tells me something about the way Jefferson imagines the world and himself in it. Jefferson is constituted by his body and by his property. And so harm is harm to property or body. Once you start imagining the self as your feelings, the capacity for harm is massively expanded, as is the capacity for victimhood. And this is why traditional freedoms, such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion, which Jefferson is, of course, arguing for in that passage, become problematic. Because the freedom to speak becomes part of the problem, not the solution at that point. Using certain words hurts people. Now, it's very trendy to talk about snowflakes and belittle the hypersensitivity, as it's perceived, of young people today. I'm not so persuaded by that, because I think they do actually imagine the world to be such that words are deeply hurtful and harmful, that the hurt they feel is real hurt, precisely because they've been taught to think of themselves in terms of their feelings. So the political consequence of this is harm, violence, moves into the linguistic sphere, if I could put it that way. Words become weapons. And so when we hear language about, those words damage me, I think we need to take that seriously. That arises out of a way of imagining the self. And that's why I think I'd like to say the First Amendment will be strong enough to protect religious liberty, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure with the rising generation that the world that we imagine for the First Amendment to make sense is any longer the way the rising generation imagines the world to be. Thanks.
Is it a brief question? Is it really good? Okay.
I'll take one more.
All right.
Anybody else who comes up the podium? No way, you're cut off.
That last question sparked a question in my heart about this. So, talking about snowflakes and how there's people out there who are very sensitive on this topic. Being a college student and being surrounded by people like this, what advice would you give me, being somebody who doesn't compromise my beliefs but shows love and grace?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And like all pastoral questions, it's not a one-size-fits-all. You have to use a lot of wisdom in this situation. First of all, I would press on you, as a college student, it's not your job to change the world. It's your job to get a qualification so you can go off and be an adult, maybe then change the world. So I certainly want to say to you, watch your back in these situations. I don't think you're compromising. There are plenty of people making big money out of evangelicalism who keep their mouths shut on this stuff. They're the people who are going to be held to account for it. I don't think it's your job as a college student to die on every hill. Having said that, there may be a hill you have to die on. When my own son was at college, he got on well with his track teammates, but there came a day when the coach told the track they'd all got to wear the rainbow armbands. And for my son, who'd just become a Christian actually at that point, that was a step too far, and he wouldn't do it. It was 6 years ago, and he got away with it. I'm not sure he'd get away with it today, but he got away with it then. But that was a watershed moment for me, because I'm thinking, wow, if my son is willing to take a stand like that, I need to start speaking up more on these things as well. So not every hill is one to die on, but there may come a hill to die on. Thirdly, I would say, keep your friendships broad. This may be a naive belief at this point, but I still like to think that if you can be friendly with people, most people will treat you with decency. Maybe I'm wrong on that. I hope I'm not. But my experience of people that I disagree with has been that I have been able to maintain friendships with them when they know that I treat them well. So it may well be that you need to keep your mouth shut in certain circumstances. It may well be that not every time a subject comes up, you need to go on and on about it. You need to make that judgment for yourself, and you need to be able to live with your own conscience. But I also think you need to realize the weight of the world does not rest on your shoulders. It's for guys like me and my generation to step up at this point and engage in battle. You need to get your degree.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's a yes or no question, sir. Is that okay?
Okay, this is the very last one.
All right.
My
I understand.
individualism is
I respect your
trying
time,
to come
sir. So my question is simply, growing up, not remembering 9/11, and all this confusion, either it's sexual or theological, has it always been like this?
I would say I lived in the United States for 6 months in 1996 when I was a visiting fellow at Calvin College in Michigan. And I came to the United States permanently in 2001. I arrived 3 weeks before 9/11. So I would say that as a sort of insider-outsider, I have observed dramatic changes in American life. And I would say the country that I live in now is unrecognizable relative to the country I moved to. Some good things, many, many bad things. But no, it has not always been like this. I think that social acceleration has really taken over. I said to students today, one of the words that was often on the news when I first came to America, used by both the left and the right on the news, the word was un-American, which always amused me as an Englishman because there was no English equivalent. Un-English sounds comical. But un-American meant something serious. It meant that this person did not represent American values in some way. I never hear that word now. And my assumption is I never hear that word because the very notion of what it means to be an American is no longer a matter of consensus in this country. And that's a very, very worrying position for a nation to be in. So I hate to give the bad news, but no, it has not always been like this. The world is... It's hard to believe that President Obama, in his election campaigns, had to distance himself from gay marriage. It's hard to believe that the president of Grove City College, Paul McNulty, was appointed, I think, Deputy Attorney General of the United States by a unanimous vote of the session, around about 2005. The country today is nothing compared to the country I moved to in 2001. If I had to describe it in any way, I'd say this: America has a dramatic crisis of conscience and purpose at this point.
That brings our evening to a conclusion. I want to thank Dr. Trueman again. Would you join with me in thanking him? Also want to take the opportunity to thank our partnership with Grove City College. Our evening tonight was a joint effort between Beverly Heights Church, the Scattered Seeds podcast, and Grove City College. Dr. Trueman was kind enough to sit for an interview with our podcast earlier. That will be out in a month or so, and you'll be able to have access to that on our website, thescatteredseedspodcast.com. And as Dr. Trueman said, we as a people of God, need to be formed in particular ways so that we can be men and women that are able to resist the great pressures that we're under and that we're experiencing in our culture today. And I can think of a few things that are shared by Christians of every denomination, stripe, tribe, than the doxology. And so I'd like to invite you to stand as we sing together the doxology, and then we'll bring our evening to a close.